Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. If you remember, about a month and a half ago, I did a preliminary review or an impressions video about the Anbernic RG35XX. And if you remember this video here, what I really talked about was the fact that I didn't think it was ready for a full review, and that mostly had to do with the software because it was pretty buggy and I really didn't like it. Well, it turns out that since the release of that video, we've seen a lot of great updates, primarily with a custom firmware called GarlicOS. Now, I've already made a quick video about GarlicOS to show off some of its preliminary features, and you may remember that I actually made a written guide that I've been keeping up to date about that as well. And I gotta say, we've gotten to the point now where I think it's time to do a final review of the RG35XX. Now, GarlicOS has actually been updated almost every single day, and so it just keeps getting better and better. But at the same time, it's really gotten to that point where I think it's time to make the review. And so in this video, we're gonna do all of the things that I typically will do in a review video. We may not touch on every single detail that I've already covered, but at least this will give you one good kind of overview of whether or not I think this device is gonna be worth the pretty reasonable $55 price point. And so my goal for you as you watch this video is that you can walk away knowing whether or not it's going to be worth it for you. Now, as you may know, there are many variables when it comes to reviewing a retro handheld. For example, there are multiple color variations available for this model. I do have a second one here in place. This is the retro gray model, but there's also a transparent purple model that I have not reviewed myself. And so I can't really say whether or not which color is better between the three, but at least I can talk a little bit about the color differences between the two. So we'll do that here in this video as well. Now, there's also a medium-sized elephant in the room, and that is the Miyoo Mini Plus. This is a device that's going to be coming out next month and has just about the same form factor and size as the RG35XX here. And that one, as you can imagine, is just a little bit larger of an upgrade of the Miyoo Mini that came out last year that took the world by storm. And so this one is kind of a compelling idea as well. It's going to be around the same price point, maybe a little bit more expensive, but it will also have Wi-Fi, which is a feature that I've really wanted to have on a small handheld, and so that might actually be pretty cool too. Now, I expect that I'll be getting the Miyoo Mini Plus here very soon to review, and so when I do, I obviously will make a video about it, but for now, we're just really going to focus on the Anbernic RG35XX on its own with GarlicOS and whether or not I think that combination on its own is actually going to be worth it for you. And I gotta say, it's pretty awesome. Anyway, without any further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, to start, we're going to talk a little bit about specs, but I'm mostly going to ignore the stuff on the left. And that's because with a low-powered and low-priced device like this, it really doesn't matter what chipset it's using, it's more about the experience. And so to sum it up here, it has a 3.5-inch display with a resolution of 640 by 480. That means it has a native 4:3 aspect ratio, which is going to work perfectly for most of the games it's going to run. In terms of battery life, I would expect about 4 hours on average. In terms of features, it has a rumble motor, but then also HDMI out if you wanted to plug it into a TV. And then also the USB-C charging port can function as an OTG port as well. That means you can plug in a controller too. In terms of pricing, it's currently $55 plus shipping, and that can depend on where you live. You can buy it directly from Anbernic on their store with warehouses in either China or the United States, and you can also pick it up at this price from their AliExpress store as well. Now, like I mentioned a moment ago, I said that the processing speed really isn't that important as opposed to what it can actually play. And so let's talk about that next. In terms of classic systems, this can play most of them here. And so when it comes to handheld systems, it can emulate things like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, as well as the Sega properties like Sega Game Gear. From a home console standpoint, it can play anything from the 8 and 16-bit era, and then when you move up to Generation 5 of consoles, it can play PlayStation 1 as well. And then finally, among the more mainstream content here, you can also play a lot of arcade games. I would say everything up to and including Capcom Play System 3. That means you'll be able to play most of the arcade classics all the way up through the early 90s, as well as the entire Neo Geo system. Now, thanks to new custom firmware, we also have access to a lot more systems than just the big ones. And so as you can see on this screen here, there are a lot of other systems that are supported now too. And so if there is a system from the 80s and 90s that isn't one of the big dogs like Nintendo or Sega, the chances are that it might be able to play on this device too. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I have two different color schemes right here, the transparent white one as well as the new gray one. Now, initially, I spent a lot of time with the transparent one. I really like the look of that white PCB. It just looks very clean. But now that I've had the gray one in my hands, I've actually been preferring that over the transparent one. To me, it just has a more retro and classic vibe to it, and it just seems to fit a lot more with the systems that I'm playing on it as well. And so for the rest of this video here, we're just going to use the gray one just to keep it consistent. Now I spent quite a bit of time in my impressions video talking about the fit and feel of this device, but let's do a quick recap here. Now the RG35XX will come with a screen protector, and I've already installed it here on this device. And so that's why the glass screen here is bulging a little bit from the outside. Now the nice thing about this screen is that there's a little bit of an indentation, and so applying the screen protector is super easy because there's only one way it'll fit. And personally, I really like the look of the installed screen protector right here. I think it looks nice and classy. Okay, so now let's get into the buttons, and we'll start with the D-pad. This has a classic retro feel because it's using a rubber membrane connection. That means it's going to have a bouncy texture to it, very similar to a classic gamepad. And among the different ones released by Anbernic, this one's a little bit stiffer than the others. Now personally, I like that feel. It feels more precise to me. But we'll also do some D-pad testing later in the video to see how it works in different use cases. Next, we'll talk about the face buttons. These are one of the very few face buttons from Anbernic that are actually glossy. And these also have a rubber membrane connection, which means they're going to have that classic bouncy feel. And I also like these buttons a lot as well. They are very responsive and have a nice feel to them. So no complaints there. Now the menu, select, and start buttons here also have a rubber membrane connection very similar to the D-pad and face buttons. And these buttons are made out of a hard plastic, and so even though they might remind you of an old Game Boy one which had those mushy buttons, they don't feel like that at all. And so I would say these feel good as well. On the left side, we have a volume button here, up and down. And then on the right, we have a power button, a reset button, and then two different micro SD card slots. Now this setup here with the two cards is very similar to other Anbernic devices. You can use the first card just for the software itself, and then the second card to store games. Or if you'd like, you can put both the software and the games on just one SD card and put that in the first one. And so here you have the flexibility to use a smaller card for the software and then something larger for the games, or just use a larger one for both. Okay, looking at the back here, we have a few different contour grips right here for your fingers to rest on while you're using it. And then also we have the shoulder and trigger buttons right here. Now these have a bit of a ski slope kind of angle to them, and they have a very soft clickiness to them. One of my favorite things about these buttons is that they're pretty quiet when you click down on them. On the bottom, we have a headphone jack as well as a USB-C port. This can be used both to charge the device as well as to plug it into some peripherals like a controller. And then up top, we have a mini HDMI port here as well as indicator lights for when it's charging. Okay, in terms of overall ergonomics, this is a vertical handheld, which means there's not going to be a lot of space for your hands. But one of the things I do like about this device is those ski slope shoulder and trigger buttons mean that you have a place to rest your index fingers. And so generally what I will do is I'll leave my index fingers up top above those buttons and then leave the other ones underneath. It is a little bit awkward to access the trigger buttons in particular, the L2 and R2 buttons, but to be honest, the systems that actually play on this device, you'll never actually be using them much. If anything, you can use those for hotkeys, like be able to load and save a state, but other than that, they're going to be largely unused. And so I think in terms of overall ergonomics, it's not terrible, but it is a vertical handheld, which means it's going to be a little bit cramped feeling compared to something that's horizontal. But I think for its size, I'm not sure what the company could have done differently. Now, speaking of size, let's compare it against some other popular handhelds so you can get an idea of what it's going to be like. To start, here's the original Game Boy, and as you can see, it is quite a bit smaller than that. Same thing with the Game Boy Color. I would say it's a little bit wider, but also quite a bit shorter too. And it's also quite a bit smaller overall from the Analog Pocket. Now, Anbernic has been making vertical handhelds for years, and so let's compare it against some of the others that they've released. To start, here's the RG351V. This one came out a couple years ago, and as you can see, it's quite a bit smaller, but I do like that this one has an analog stick. Next up, we have the RG353V, which came out last year, and I really like this device too. And the size and shape of this one is pretty close. The big difference here is that it's taller because it has those analog sticks on the bottom. Additionally, the RG353V is quite a bit more powerful than the 35XX, but it is also about twice the price. And finally, among the other Anbernic devices, the other one I like to compare it with is the RG280V right here. Now, I've had this one for a couple years now, and I've really loved it. I've used this probably more than a lot of my other small handhelds. And really, I would say that the device we're reviewing today is actually the successor to the 280V. It's obviously a little bit larger than the RG280V, but at the same time, it is quite a bit more comfortable thanks to the larger size and the better ergonomics. Additionally, the screen is a little bit larger too at 3.5 inches versus 2.8, height, and it also has a higher 640 by 480 resolution. And finally, it also has a better chip inside, and so even though it also plays the same systems all the way up to PS1, it does a better job of doing that. And so when it comes to smaller handhelds made by Anbernic that are specifically made to play PS1 and below, I have found that the RG35XX has basically replaced my 280V in everyday use. And finally, the last size comparison I want to make is the Miyoo Mini versus the 35XX. And as you can see, the 35XX is also quite a bit larger than this one too. And we'll do a bit more comparison between these two later in the video. Suffice to say, I would say that the 35XX is a smaller handheld, but I wouldn't call it a mini handheld by any means. It doesn't have that same kind of cute pocketability of something like the 280V or the Miyoo Mini, but all the same, it is quite small and easy to take around. If anything, I would say it's a pretty good middle ground between those mini devices as well as those that are larger. And it's almost like it's at a good sweet spot here. The 3.5-inch screen means you're not going to have to squint too much to see everything, but at the same time it is small enough to fit in your pocket. Now most days I'm wearing shorts because I live in Hawaii, but today I put on some pants just for you folks so you could see what it's like to put the RG35XX in some pants pockets. And as you can see, yes, it definitely will fit, but at the same time it's a little bit bulkier than I would like. And I think these shoulder buttons are the culprit here because they have that nice ski slope to them, which makes them ergonomic. It also has a little bit more bulk. And so I would liken it to having a cell phone in your pocket, but one of those cell phone cases that either have your wallet or a pop socket attached to it. Now, if you watched my impressions video, you know that I was not a big fan of the stock operating system that comes with this device. The way I see it, the stock firmware experience is kind of a stepping stone to getting something better down the line. As it stands right now, the device will come with a 64GB card that's going to be loaded up with games and the same firmware. And so if you're really looking to just launch the most popular games, then chances are you might be able to find them within here. But I also recommend checking out that impressions video because I kind of go in depth about all of the flaws with this specific system. And so we're not really going to talk about the stock operating system in this video here because we have a much better option available to us and it's very easy to get set up. And so for the rest of the video, we're going to focus on GarlicOS. This is a custom firmware that's been out for over a month at this point and it keeps getting better every day. And on my website, I have a GarlicOS starter guide. This will walk you through everything, including how to install it from scratch, either in a single or dual card setup, and then also how to load your own games and configure the settings, and even how to update it later down the line. And so I'll have a link to this written guide in the video description if you happen to pick this up and you want to get a little bit more out of your device. And so let's just go ahead and dive in, and as you can see here, I have a 2-card setup. Now, booting into GarlicOS is pretty darn fast. As you can see here, it's a little over 8 seconds from start to finish. And the interface here is dead simple. You have the ability to go to your recent files, and then you can make a favorites list as well. And then you can browse through the consoles you have loaded up, as well as go into RetroArch to get into the settings. Now, the only consoles that are going to show up in your menu here are going to be the ones that have ROMs inside their folder. And so I only have a sampling of different systems right here, and that's because these are the only systems that have games inside their folders. And the whole navigation experience here is very intuitive. You would just go to the system and then find your game and then load it up from here. And a few weeks ago, I made an entire GarlicOS video, and so if you want to learn more about some of the intricacies, I would check that out. But there have been a couple updates that are really exciting. For example, if you press start while in the main menu, it'll bring up a real-time clock option right here. And so here you can set the time and date for the system in case you want to use that for games that require it, like Pokemon games. Another simple but powerful update that's come out recently is the ability to over or underclock the CPU. And to do this, all you have to do is press the select button while in the main menu. We have 4 different options here. We have a plus, a double plus, and then a minus and a double minus. And you can toggle through these and they'll show up in the battery indicator section right here. As you can imagine, the double plus is the highest overclock and the double minus is going to be your lowest underclock. And of course, no symbol means you're just going to leave it at the standard clocks for the CPU. And honestly, that's really about it when it comes to the menu interface. The only other thing I can think of is that if you press the menu button, you can actually change the brightness by adjusting it with the volume buttons here. And as you can see, there's quite a good dynamic range of dimness and brightness depending on what environment you're playing in. Now, like I mentioned, getting into the game is very simple. You would just go into the system, then pick your game, and then press the A button to start it up. And while we're in here, let's do a quick audio test right now. Overall, I would say the audio quality here is just okay. I would give it maybe a 7 out of 10. It has some good clarity to it, and I think it can get quite loud too, but also it's lacking in bass. And so I would say this is about what I was expecting for a device at this price point. Now, one of my favorite features when it comes to navigating through the games is actually just going through the Recents tab right here. As you start playing games, it's actually going to save a save state of directly when you were last playing that game. And so here you can cycle through the last 8 or 10 games that you played. And the cool thing here is when you pick any of these games, it'll actually start right back up where you were. Now to exit a game, all you have to do is press this menu button once, and it'll bring you back to wherever you were last within the main menu. And really, that's about it when it comes to navigation. You can go in and check the system and then pick the game from there. But honestly, I spend most of my time in the recent section, so I can kind of cycle through the same games at once. Either way, I really appreciate how this is all set up, and it's mostly inspired by Onion OS originally for the Miyoo Mini. Now, if you're familiar with emulation and the RetroArch system, you can actually go into RetroArch directly here, and within here you can adjust all the settings if you'd like. And this is going to be handy if you want to set up your own hotkeys or something else like that. But one of the nice things about GarlicOS is that many of the settings have already been pre-configured and optimized for you. For example, Black Seraph, who is the developer of GarlicOS, has been working behind the scenes to make some really nice scalers working for this device. And so, for example, right here, you can see that the Mega Man X bar is nice and balanced even at full screen. And there's a lot of wizardry involved here between different bilinear filters and scalers, but as you can see, the proof is in the pudding. This looks really good. And so I would say for most systems, these have been completely optimized. All you really have to do is just load up your games and then start them up, and they're going to work great. But if you have specific preferences like me, there may be some things you may want to change. For example, by default on GarlicOS, they don't have any colorization for Game Boy games. So you can go in here and press Menu and X to get into the quick menu. And then within here, you can go into the core options and then adjust the colorization to whatever you like. And so, for example, here I just changed it to the DMG colorization. Additionally, the handheld systems are actually scaled to the full 4:3 aspect ratio, but I actually prefer the original one. And I have instructions in my written guide on how to set all of this up individually if you'd like. Either way, what I want to show right here is that it's very quick to go in and adjust the aspect ratio, and you can actually just save it for every Game Boy game after that. And so here we are playing an original Game Boy game with the DMG colorization and then also the proper 10:9 aspect ratio. Of course, all of these settings are optional, but I prefer to play the games at least as close to the original hardware as I can. And that's one of the nice things about GarlicOS is that you can fine-tune those settings if you'd like. And so, for example, here's the same thing here where I've adjusted the aspect ratio for Game Boy Color, so it has that 10:9 aspect ratio. And then also same here with Game Boy Advance. This one had an original 3:2 aspect ratio, and so I've adjusted it within the settings to match that as well. Either way, like I mentioned, you can make these adjustments within the settings, and I have it all written out in that written guide. Now, one thing I didn't spend too much time in my impressions video is just really talking about the quality of the screen. I think when it comes to the level of saturation and color accuracy, I think it's actually pretty good. And as I showed earlier, you have a pretty good dynamic range between bright and dim depending on where you're playing. And so I think when it comes to some of these cheaper LCD panels, this one's pretty good. It has a nice resolution for the size, and then the colors are nice and vibrant, and the screen isn't too cool or too warm either. And so when it comes down to it, I have no complaints about the quality of the screen here. I think it's pretty good, especially at this price point. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about controls. There are usually two types of games that I like to test when it comes to a D-pad. Number one is a platforming game. So here's Super Mario World. And in my opinion here, everything feels very tight and precise. I enjoy it a lot when it comes to platforming games. Now, when it comes to fighting games, typically what I will do is I'll test it out with some Hadoukens and Shoryukens, and yeah, it works pretty well. It did take me a few hours to adjust to the D-pad and the amount of pressure I needed to give to pull off a special move, but after that it was pretty good. However, I have seen reports from others who have said that they have gotten some accidental diagonals when playing games. And so depending on your playstyle, you may like this D-pad, you may not, it's really hard to say. But at least for me, when it comes to platformers, it works out really well, and same thing with fighting games, it took some adjustment, but after that I was happy. Now in terms of gameplay, among these supported systems, almost every single one of these games are just going to play fine right out of the box. And so when it comes to like your 16-bit systems, and even the 32-bit ones like the 32X right here, yeah, they're going to be fine. In particular, I really enjoyed playing PS1 games on this screen. I think the screen size here is just about right for this particular system. And in general, I think the device is going to be a great fit if you wanted to play through some of those classic PlayStation role-playing games. For example, I've been thinking about taking my Final Fantasy VIII save game from the Retroid Pocket 3 and pushing it over to this device instead. Although to be honest, currently I think I'm stuck in a cave in that game and I'm not really sure where to go, and so I might have to start over from scratch. Either way, my struggles with the Final Fantasy series aside, I think this is going to be really good for playing role-playing games in a smaller form factor. Now, as expected at a $55 price point, the CPU in this device is somewhat low powered. And so for certain systems, you may get some struggling here and there. For example, one of the hardest Super Nintendo games to emulate is Yoshi's Island, and for the most part it actually plays really well. But there will be some scenes here and there, especially the title screen, where it'll definitely dip below 60 frames per second. As you can see, we're getting an average of about 48 frames per second here at the title screen. Now the title screen is actually really hard to run on this, even harder than the game itself. But all the same, if you want to get this screen to work at full speed as well, it's just a matter of using that overclock function that we talked about earlier. And so here's that same title screen, but with that plus overclock enabled, and as you can see, yeah, it's running at a smooth 60 right here. And so my advice here would be just to try every game at the normal clock speed, and then if it's not running at full speed, there may be some few games that you'll have to actually overclock. But even then, after you enable the overclock, I didn't find any game that didn't run at full speed across the board. That included the hardest to run PS1 games like Bloody Roar 2, as well as Capcom PlaySystem 3 games like Street Fighter 3 or Red Earth. And so in the end, when it comes to performance, I have found that all of the supported systems are 100% playable. It's just a matter of maybe enabling that overclock on a certain few games. Now in my written guide, I have a couple other options you can do within GarlicOS, so let's talk about that real quick. To start, you can change the themes or the skins for GarlicOS, and it's very easy. And there's actually a new website called 35xx.com that actually hosts all of these different themes, and I have that linked in the written guide, and I have instructions on how to swap them out. Either way, it's super simple. It's just a matter of moving over a folder, and after that you can change the layout and look of your device. So that's definitely something to look out for if you're interested. Now additionally, there's one other feature that's a little bit more advanced, but it's definitely possible, and that is that you can add box art to your menus as well. Now the process is a little bit involved. You have to scrape all of the box art and then put them in specific folders, and then also run a script to resize them so that they fit accordingly on the screen. After that, it's a matter of changing a couple lines of code within the settings so that the text is oriented correctly. I would say overall it took me about an hour to set everything up on my device. That included scraping all the artwork, then moving it over, running a script to resize it, and then finally to justify the text. And so if you're looking for a weekend project for your 35XX and you want to add your box art, it is possible, and it's all explained in my written guide. Okay, and finally the next feature I want to show off is the ability to have video out on this console. It's really just a matter of getting a micro HDMI cable or adapter and then hooking that up to your TV or computer monitor, and then you can play it right there. And thankfully GarlicOS is relatively plug and play when it comes to setting up this HDMI signal. Now the experience is not perfect. For example, it scales at full screen when you go into HDMI mode. That means if you're going to plug it into a typical TV, which is at a 16:9 aspect ratio, it's going to be full screen and stretch it out. Now some TVs have an option to actually adjust the signal to 4:3, but I don't think most TVs will have that. For example, of all the monitors and screens I have, I think only maybe one of them has that option. But if you're okay with playing games at a full screen like this to stretch everything out, then actually it's going to work out just fine. Now if you want to play with an external controller as well, that's also possible, but it is going to take a little bit of configuration. When it comes down to it, GarlicOS cannot anticipate every single controller that gets plugged in, and so what you'll have to do is you'll have to go into RetroArch and readjust the controls when you plug in a controller. But after you have it set up, it does work pretty well. There's no input lag or anything else like that. However, I would say this entire setup is not very plug and play. If you're expecting something like a Nintendo Switch experience, this really isn't going to be it. But all the same, it is pretty awesome to see something like this out of a device that only costs $55. Okay, so I hope that gave you an idea of what to expect from the RG35XX. Now let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about the device. To start, I think it's a good size. It's a middle ground between the really small devices that are a little bit more cramped and squinty and those larger ones that aren't as portable. Additionally, I think the device is very sturdy in the hands. I think that I would be very comfortable giving this to a child, no problem. It's also very cool that Anbernic ships it with a screen protector, and so you can already have that protection just right out of the box. As we saw throughout the video, we have a nice screen here, a 480p resolution, and that 3.5-inch display size is actually pretty good for a device this size. I also think this is a very good price. At $55 plus shipping, that's about the same price as like an Xbox or PlayStation game, but you could load this thing up with thousands of games instead. Now, another thing I like about this device, and Anbernic devices in general, is that we generally don't have any supply issues. And if, like everybody else, you've been trying to get your hands on a Miyoo Mini, then you're not going to have those same issues here with this device. And finally, I think the biggest ticket item for the RG35XX is that the Garlic operating system here just makes everything better when it comes to the overall experience. The developer behind GarlicOS has basically transformed this device to something that I was very mediocre about to something I'm actually very excited to share with others. For most of last year, I had this exact same feeling when it came to OnionOS and the Miyoo Mini. Additionally, that was a device I was kind of lukewarm about, but then the operating system just kind of transformed that overall experience, and we're getting the exact same thing with GarlicOS. Now, of course, like with any other device, the Anbernic RG35XX is not perfect, and so let's talk about a few of the things that I don't like about it. Number one, I would not call this D-pad perfect. It is pretty good, but I can definitely see why others might have problems with accidental diagonals or they feel that it's too stiff. Now, personally, I was able to adjust to it, but if you're someone who's very sensitive about having very precise inputs, then you may or may not like that experience, and I wanted to put that out there. Additionally, one of those features that I really wish the 35XX had is Wi-Fi. This would allow you to log into retro achievements via RetroArch so that you can get achievements for playing retro games. Now, I'm aware that that is a very niche use case, but once you actually get started with that, it's a lot of fun. And so for a device that gets so many things right, it just feels like a missing feature because it would have put it over the edge. And finally, I was a little bit disappointed about the whole consoleized experience here. It's just not very plug and play to hook it up to HDMI and then a controller. It does take some finagling with these settings. And so if you primarily were looking at using this as a hybrid device, like a handheld that you can then plug into a TV and have a very seamless experience, I would say it's not quite going to be there. But it is nice to be able to plug it into a TV every once in a while. And so to wrap things up, I think we should talk about the Miyoo Mini for a second. Last year, this was definitely my favorite small device to play. I love the tiny size of the device as well as the feel of the D-pad and the buttons. Now, it did have some detractors. For example, it is a very fragile device, and I had to keep mine in a case all year long. I read so many stories of people dropping theirs and their screen would break, or maybe the shoulder buttons wouldn't work anymore, or sometimes the back panel would just fall right out. And so the Miyoo Mini was awesome, but also fragile. On top of that, it was so popular that it was very hard to get a hold of after about summer of 2022. In fact, for the past month or two, the device has been impossible to find, and part of that is because Miyoo has been starting to work on a new device, the Miyoo Mini Plus. Now, the Miyoo Mini Plus is going to be about the exact same size of the 35XX. It's going to have the same size screen, but then the same hardware and chipset as the original Miyoo Mini. In addition, they're going to be adding Wi-Fi to that device as well. And so I totally understand why there is some excitement about the Miyoo Mini Plus. After all, it's going to have a larger size, which will make it more comfortable, and that added Wi-Fi is going to be pretty awesome too. However, I think it's also prudent to face the facts. Miyoo has been having supply chain issues for about a year at this point. And given their previous track record, it doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence when it comes to fulfillment of their next device. In fact, just yesterday, I read that Miyoo pushed back the launch of the Miyoo Mini Plus from February to March. Now, that may very well be because they're trying to make a huge stockpile of devices for when they launch, but all the same, it still makes me a little bit cautious about saying to wait for the Miyoo Mini Plus. And so in summary of this little section here, yes, the Miyoo Mini is awesome, and I wish they had more of them available because I still really like the small size of this device. And I'm also excited to check out the Miyoo Mini Plus. I just hope there's going to be enough of them to meet demand. And also, I would say that the existence of the Miyoo Mini or the Miyoo Mini Plus doesn't take away from the fact that the Anbernic RG35X is also a great deal. When you think about it, it's kind of amazing how much excellent retro gaming you're getting at a device that costs only $55 plus shipping. Not only do we have the performance unlocked to be able to play every PS1 and below game with no problem, but it's also wrapped around an entire operating system experience that's only a month old and very, very good already. And it also comes together in a very nice hardware package too. We have an excellent screen, good D-pad and buttons, and also relatively good ergonomics for being a vertical handheld. And to top it off, we have some sturdy build quality, which means this device is going to work well for years to come. And so in the end, if you're in the market for a smaller and cheaper handheld device to be able to play PS1 and below games, do I recommend the Anbernic RG35XX? And to that, I would say absolutely. There are a couple little things I could nitpick, but in the end of the day, for the price that we're getting right here, this thing is an absolute steal. In fact, among the 6 or 7 devices that Anbernic has released in the past year, many of them bad, but some of them pretty good, I would say that this one actually has the best balance between performance, price, and nostalgia. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Among the many budget handhelds out there, which one do you like the best? For me right now, I think it's actually going to be the 35XX, but I'm also curious to see how everything rolls out when it comes to the Miyoo Mini Plus. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.